So listen, we have folks from all across North Carolina state government here today. Several different agencies, departments, divisions, units. But I also wanted to acknowledge that we've got a good turnout from folks outside of state government, including our local government. So Mecklenburg County is in the House, Guilford County. We have folks from the Cape Fear Community College. So this thing's really extending beyond the borders of state government, and we're thrilled for that. So welcome. A few things, a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get this thing going. First of all, restrooms back behind the elevators. And I see a lot of people with coffee cups in your hands, so you're seeing that we've got snacks, water, coffee. Our barista Phil will hook you up with a good coffee right around the corner here. And let's see, so if you're on social media, we're using the hashtag WeAreNCGov today. So WeAreNCGov is our hashtag. If you're posting that on Twitter, look for the wireless network iCenter guest also. Okay, so I think that's our housekeeping. I'm going to keep it brief because I know we want to get this thing going. I'm so appreciative of our two leaders over here, Eric Boyette, the Secretary for the Department of Information Technology and the State CIO, and Jim Whitehurst, the Chief Executive Officer of Red Hat. Would you all put your hands together and welcome these two leaders for this fireside chat this morning?
Thank you, Billy. So that may have been the briefest intro I think Billy's ever done. Thank you, Billy. Thank you all for showing up today and taking interest in our WeAreNCGov. As Billy said, this is our third event, and we're excited. These events are starting to become the culture that we like to present here at DIT. And it's something we're going to talk about today is, culture. And, what does that mean? How do we change, and what do we look forward to in the future? So with that, we're going to jump in. Jim, thank you for being with us today, and I know you have a busy schedule.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking time out for us today.
Great to be here, and let me just first off say thank you all. As a longtime resident now of North Carolina, I guess I've been here a little over 11 years. I've raised my family here, and we've availed ourselves of all the services that you provide. So I'm thrilled to be here and get a chance to chat, and especially just say thank you all for your service to the state and what it's meant to certainly citizens like me and my family. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always exciting when we can sit down and share ideas and talk about just our past and what our future looks like. So with that, how about give us a brief overview of your business career. I know you had some time at Delta as a senior exec and now started this open source software development company, Red Hat. So talk to us about that a little bit.
All right, so I'll try to do that quickly because probably don't want to hear that much about me. But I was a techie in high school. This is when computers were just coming out. I had a K-Pro 2 for anybody old enough to remember that, programming. I actually started this little software company when I was in high school that did contact management software for stockbrokers, and but still decided to go to college. I wasn't a Mark Zuckerberg kind of guy. So went to Rice University, got a degree in computer science and economics. And in that period of time, I realized while I love programming, I probably wanted to do something a little more businessy with it. So, at the time, that was back before email really existed. So it's dropping physical resumes and envelopes. And got interviewed by a company called the Boston Consulting Group, which is a strategy consulting firm. Looked like a great way to learn about business and apply a little bit of what I knew. So I went to BCG at the time in Chicago and ended up falling in love with it. I love client service. I love working, trying to make people successful. And so I ended up, went back to business school. They sent me back, which was wonderful. That's awesome. And then stayed all the way through, and I was a partner at BCG, very, very happy, and never thought I would leave. And my largest client was Delta Airlines, and literally at noon on 9/11, the CEO called me and said, "I need you to be our treasurer now." And I said, Leo, the guy's name was Leo Mullins, Leo, I know nothing about treasury. He says, "That's okay. Nobody in their right mind would loan us money now, so I don't need a prototypical treasurer." So I literally joined Delta at noon on 9/11 and as treasurer and ran strategy and business development, and did that for a couple of years, ultimately ran the network and was ultimately named chief operating officer, which basically everything but finance. So that was marketing strategy. It was everything kind of. And that was, I'm still amazed they did this. I was 35 years old. I then had, 80,000 people working for me, and we were hurling into bankruptcy. And as I say, if I knew what I knew now, I probably would have said, that's insane, I'm not taking it, but I wasn't smart enough then. So anyway, ended up running Delta through the bankruptcy restructuring. When we emerged, new board forms, they wanted to bring their own CEO in, and so I was out of a job. And I was interviewing with a lot of companies around, mainly doing kind of turnaround stuff, because that's kind of what Delta was. And I get this random call about Red Hat. And the headhunter said, you probably have never heard of Red Hat. I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm running that at home. Because, I'm still been techie and I've used it a lot, Linux a lot. And so came and met the CEO, and he and I clicked. And I remember when I went home, and I think this is important when you kind of get into, my wife, literally when I walked in, she said, you're going to take that job. And I said, well, why? She said, because it's the first time I've seen a sparkle like that in your eye in a long time. So I've really been passionate about it since day one, and it's been really exciting. I've been at Red Hat now, I can't believe it, 11 years. Wow. We've gone from like 1,600 people to 13,000, and doing one product to kind of a whole portfolio. It's been just a pleasure to be a part of.
That's awesome. That's an awesome career.
The mic's just a little bit closer here.
All right.
Excuse me. There we go.
Do we need to speak louder, Billy? Is that what you're telling us? So when some of the people in here may understand what open source means, and so can you talk to us about open source, and how do you make money off open source?
Yeah, that's always the one. How do you make money off of something that's free? My favorite's when somebody's holding a bottle of like $4 water, leaning against a water cooler and saying, why would somebody pay for something that's free? Anyway, so let me start off just a little bit on what open source software is, why it's important, and then I'll talk a little bit about the business model. So computers run ones and zeros, right? So the computer code is a bunch of ones and zeros. That starts off as code that humans write that is readable. It may not be English, but it's human readable and editable, that is then typically compiled into ones and zeros. And so when you buy Windows or Microsoft Office or something else, you're buying the ones and zeros. You can use it, but you can't really see what's going on. It's unintelligible. Open source is a principle of, hey, we're going to also distribute the source code. So open source stands for open source code. So the code is available with it, and there's a bunch of intricacies around the license that actually forces that to be open. But what that ultimately does is it gets bigger groups of people to participate in it, because now, when we make changes to Linux, or any of our products, we have to put those out, and then others can make changes, and others can make changes. And so you end up getting this really powerful kind of community built around, various pieces of software. And so that's the power of open source, is that you can get a lot of people involved. Now, of course, the problem is, because the source code's free, how do you make money with it? But let me just talk for 2 seconds back on the code, and then I'll come back and talk about the business model. And the reason I do this, I think it's really, really important for the nature of innovation more broadly, which is powered by open source, but it's not really open source. And what I mean by that is, the reason open source has gotten so popular is it enables what I'll call user-driven innovation. And I would argue that the majority of innovation that we are seeing today in technology is coming from IT users, not IT vendors. Right. Now, to be clear, the lines start to blur because the users become vendors. But if you think about Google or Amazon, they're pumping out massive amounts of code, which is a byproduct of the fact that they are big IT users. Now, of course, they've also now offering cloud services, so one can argue they're a vendor, but that code's coming out because they're users. You take something like big data. Big data exists because Google had to index the World Wide Web to allow you to do searches, and they created something called Bigtable and a technology called MapReduce, and then others, Yahoo had the same problem, so they created a project called Hadoop. And the details are less important, but other than to say the vast majority of innovations we're seeing today are coming from IT users. The advances we're seeing in machine learning and AI aren't coming because some vendor said, I'm going to write this with an enterprise in mind. It is because Google and Amazon, are working on Hey Google, and Alexa, and Apple's working on Siri, and all of those they're doing it in open source. Right. And that's now a byproduct that other people can use. And I think that gets to be really important, because as we all go forward as technology professionals, recognizing that we're no longer in a world where there are 3 or 4 vendors who are going to go and talk about long-term roadmaps. Right. The majority of innovation's happening in a different way, and you have to build a skill set to think about, okay, how am I going to at least conceptually ingest it, whether you actually decide to use the code? And look, I think that's just maturing a technology. I mean, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, the winners in the Industrial Revolution aren't the machine tool makers. Right. They're the people who took the machine tools and perfected mass manufacturing. And, it's Ford and GM and companies like that. And so the idea that as the core components of technologies commoditize, a lot of the pace of innovation is going to come from users. Now then the question is, okay, well, how do you ingest it? How do you make that safe and secure? And so, sorry to go off on that tangent, but I think it's really important to recognize the reason the pace of technology is moving so fast is because it's now much more distributed across users who are innovating, and there's like massive amounts of this bow wave of innovation coming in so many different areas. But again, how do you ingest it and use that, right? Now what Red Hat works to do on a small subset of all of that technology, we have maybe 25 products, is we take it and we stabilize it and we make it secure and usable in enterprise context. And what I mean by that is, take something like Linux. I'll use Linux because it's an operating system. Everybody knows what an operating system kind of is. And we're obviously kind of the Kleenex brand of Linux, so we're well known for that. But if you think about something like an operating system, your expectation when you buy it is that it's going to work for a while, meaning it's going to get bug fixes and security updates. Well, the issue with open source communities is they don't put out releases. It's not put out for sale. So when Heartbleed or Bashbug or Spectre and Meltdown happen, they're getting fixed very, very quickly in Linux. But that's upstream brand new Linux off the tree. So now let's say you're running your payroll system on Linux. You probably don't want to have to go change your payroll system to the brand new version of Linux. It's like forcing you to go from Windows 95 to whatever, Windows NT to Windows 7 to Windows 10 just to get upgrades. So you expect that there's a pathway to do that. So what Red Hat does against all our products is when we snapshot a release, we say we're going to support this for 10 years. And so 5 years later when Intel's enabling a new chip or Heartbleed happens and that's getting fixed upstream in the brand new Linux, we're fixing it in a 2-year-old version, in a 6-year-old version, in an 8-year-old version, in a 10-year-old version, so you can run your software confidently. So people often think Red Hat does support on top of open source. Our support as a percentage of revenue is like lower than Microsoft's, yet our R&D as a percentage of revenue is higher. Now part of that's our price points are lower, but a big part of that's because all that downstream sustaining engineering's real work that we do. And the same reason you buy a bottle of water, you expect you're probably not going to get sick drinking it. It's a little bit, you buy one of our products, it's safe, it's secure, you're going to get a life cycle and all those other things. Just one other comment. I'm asked about this shockingly a lot, believe it or not, from university presidents. Because as they think about, well, when content is free, so if you abstract this out, you say, when content's free, how do you build a business model? So if you say educational content becomes free or media becomes free, how do you rethink business models in a world of abundance, right? Which is, I think, really going to be important for our economy in the 21st century.
That's great. That's awesome. Awesome. And if you think about, I'm really glad you honed in on one of the things we hear a lot is about open source. It's the security side. And the fact that you continuous, go back 10 years and continue to update that product and make it secure and make it great for the market. It's just phenomenal that you guys do that, and it's great for us in the industry.
Well, and that's one of the ones, not to go off on our business model, because I know we're not here to talk about that, but open source itself is a great way to develop software, not necessarily a way to deliver software. Correct. And so downloading something random off the internet and using it and not knowing if it's patched is really, really dangerous,
Absolutely.
Right? And so that's what really thinking about supported, secured,
Absolutely.
Sold on that.
We can repeat that 3 or 4 times if any security people in the room know they want to hear that 3 or 4 times from us. But one thing I really want to talk about is culture. And I know you wrote a book, The Open Organization. Great book. Had the opportunity to read. One of the things that we're going through in our organization is that change. We're trying to push the why. Why do you do what you do? We understand what you do and where we are and what we're doing, but why do you do what you do? So can you talk a little bit about your book and how did that come about and how's that helping in some of the side effects or some of the things you've seen at Red Hat from the book?
Yeah, so first off, I'm not smart enough to come up with some new concept around management. But I had the opportunity to go from what's, I would argue, is one of the most military, top-down, hierarchical organizations that exist, which would be an airline. And well-run. I'm not saying, I mean, Delta Airlines is incredibly well-run, and really always has been, to Red Hat, which is, I would argue, highly optimized for innovation, and Forbes most innovative companies and all this other. So I think we have done a really good job of growth and innovation. And I will say, when I first came from Delta to Red Hat, my initial reaction is, this place is chaos. And they brought me in here to clean it up. It's like this wild running system, and they need adult supervision and management. And I mean, luckily, before I had a chance to clean it up, I realized it actually isn't chaos. It is a different way to run an organization for a different objective function. And so I think one of the biggest gifts that I've been given as a professional to see that. And you know the analogy about the frog in water. I think most executives, when you think about business today, business 50 years ago was primarily about driving economies of scale, standardization, how you make more units in a more standardized way reduces cost. And we've kind of run the gamut of what you can do with economies of scale, and so much of value creation now is creating new things, innovating, how let's use the example, figuring out how to make a car 5% more cheaply has value, but recognizing the average car's used 90 minutes a day, and if you can double that utilization, it's like blows away the value of taking 5%. So innovation is becoming so much more valuable today than it was. And so most executives have lived in the frog with the water slowly being turned up, where the mix of driving efficiency versus driving innovation has changed slowly, slowly, slowly. And they maybe are recognizing it now, but they haven't realized how that change has happened. Where I went from one extreme to the other, and I'm like the frog thrown in the boiling water. It's like, whoa, this world is totally, fundamentally, completely different. Right. And so the reason I wrote the book was, I didn't change things at Red Hat, but was to articulate, it's like, hey, if you've lived in these two different worlds, you realize how different they are. And so just, if there's one thing you take away from this, we can get into details. The world that most of us live in, the world that our schools teach us, the way we grow up, what we think of as professional management, is all built to optimize driving standardization and efficiency in a static environment where most people are doing rote tasks with very, very limited information. And if you look at a way to optimize that, a top-down methodology works well. And there's still examples of that. Safety, on how you're doing safety checks on an airplane, you want rigorous top-down, you want inspection, you need reinforcement. There's still a lot of places where that exists. But if you're trying to drive educated people doing non-routine or creative tasks in a dynamic, ambiguous environment with unlimited broadband information in our pockets, maybe the engineering solution to that problem looks different. And so, but executives come in every day saying, I need my organization to be more innovative, but they don't realize it's the structure, it's how we behave, it's what we celebrate, it's all of the things that we do that ultimately create culture is ultimately what drives our ability to be creative. And I think that's the most difficult task that we as leaders have to face, because that's how we're going to create value in the 21st century.
Absolutely. That's great. That's great. I know it's always, change is hard. And I know, going through that change, I know with you, especially seeing it from the top down, going from Delta to Red Hat, I can imagine, your comment about walking in, it's almost like chaos everywhere.
But yeah, and I got lucky because the benefit I had out of that was I at least got to see it in its state working. Now, most executives, you have to envision the state and get people there, right? And so first off, you got to get people in their heart of hearts to believe a new way of operating is going to make us more innovative. And then you actually have to go do it. Because even if you intellectually understand it, moving from one to the other, it's like, I don't know, depending on what sport you play, it's like trying to fundamentally change your golf swing. It's hard and it's painful. And it's a whole new set of habits that you have to build. And so you got to deeply believe it's worth it. The first time you go in and you say, I'm going to invite people to challenge what I'm saying, and I'm going to, force some arguments to happen, and those can be painful. But recognizing that's part of building a new system, that's really hard to get people to conceptualize and then actually go do.
I agree, and that's one of the things that, we've pushed very hard is, those conversations. It's great to have conversations. You don't always have to agree. We really want to disagree and push the limit and talk about, where are the differences? Let's talk about that. And what does the future look like? And how do we come together in the end to make it successful for the team?
Well, and that's one of the ones where, the old system, I will say, was all around, let me try to identify, people who are bad actors and handle them.
Right.
And so it was all about trying to drive a level of kind of a more kind of friendly, collegial, quote unquote, professional work style. I think Ed Catmull, who was the founder, one of the co-founder of Pixar, I think said it well. Now, so Pixar makes animated movies, right? So really fluffy stuff. He said, look, if you have more honesty at the water cooler than in the conference rooms, you can't be creative. Now think about that. So we all know what happens. You're in a conference room and nobody wants to disagree, and then you get with a couple people that you're really friendly with, and you're like, I can't believe it, blah, 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 blah. Right? If you can't bring that into the conference room and have those debates, it's really, really, really hard to successfully innovate. Right. And I think that's one of the things that many leaders, when they think about their job, they don't think about their job as how am I creating the context where people have those debates in a room. And I tell you, I've seen the contrasting cultures. I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean it in a positive way with IBM, where we'll have IBM people with this acquisition we're in the middle of planning for come to some of our meetings, and we'll start like really arguing in a really heated way, and they're like in shock. And of course, I'm sitting here saying, well, that's my value add. I got to set it up so that happens, and people walk out where they still are colleagues and like each other. So how you do that's a key part of what it means to be a leader if you're trying to drive innovation.
Right. That's good. That's great. So there's always buzzwords, and we hear a lot of different acronyms thrown around, like IoT, hybrid cloud in general. A lot of people still confused about cloud, and digital transformation. I know digital transformation is something that we're looking at very heavily here. So how would you describe digital transformation? What does that mean to you? What do you think of?
So there's a term in technology called trend jacking. And so digital transformation's hot, so every vendor will try to put their spin on what it means to be digital transformation. And I got one, but I'm not going to give it to you. So I'm going to step away from the vendor spin.
Got it.
Digital transformation's buying Red Hat stuff.
Got it.
So
everybody hear that?
So seriously, so digital transformation is doing several things to our context by enabling a whole new set of business models and a faster pace of working and a different way to engage with people. It is expanding what is possible for organizations to do. And digital transformation, in my view, it is how do you structure to optimize to be successful in this expanded world of what's possible? And so again, just use multiple examples of that. In the auto industry, all of a sudden, if you're Ford, you got to think maybe a little bit about getting the car 5% cheaper, but you got to worry a lot about the fact that cars use 90 minutes a day and what other orthogonal business models can come in and eat your lunch with, whether it's ride sharing or autonomous driving or all these others. You're in banking, you're freaked out about blockchain or different methods of payments and micropayments and microcredit and being disintermediated in that. And so then you got to back up for all these businesses and say, well, how do I think about kind of creating value in that new context? So to me, digital transformation is digital and technology has enabled a massive expansion of what's possible, and that sounds like a good thing, but when you're already an incumbent, it's kind of a bad thing because you kind of leveled the playing field. Right. And as a matter of fact, in many ways, it can be an encumbrance because you get new, more agile digital actors, and if your scale is no longer a source of advantage, in some ways, you have one hand tied behind your back. And so it's really going back and rethinking, okay, how do I think about a different way to innovate? And so I have twins. They're 17 years old. They're off in the middle of doing exams. But let me just use an example of what I mean by that. Because this isn't, I'll try to talk a little about technology. It's not just about coding, because coding, you could be coding automating a process that exists versus creating new. So imagine back when you were in school, because I've seen my kids doing both of these recently, and you're writing whether it's a history paper, some type of a term paper on a book or whatever that is. Now think about when you have to do a creative writing and create something net new, a creative writing assignment. And it's really interesting. I have one very creative kid and one kid who's like really, really mathy. And it's interesting to watch how difficult creative writing is. But that's a little bit what we're talking about. When you're talking about creating something new, it's the equivalent of creative writing. So it's not just, oh, I need to go code, but it's like, how am I imagining something that does not exist and bringing that to life? And as a leader, how do you create the context for that to happen? Right. And it is like so radically different than what our normal day-to-day is, that really getting people to understand that. But that's what you're asking an organization to do when you say, I mean, even something as simple like, I want to have a mobile app for, you know, whatever purpose that is. Well, all right, how do you really ideate into, well, what should that look like, and what functionality, and how will people use it, and what might that look like? I mean, those are really difficult questions. Writing the code isn't easy, but that's actually the easy part, right? You know, and so recognizing how hard that is, and we often throw people out there and then say, well, this failed, we must not be good at technology. Like, technology is the easy part, right? And so really, really recognizing how difficult creation is and how different it is from the muscle that we've all built for so many years, which is executing in a known world.
Absolutely. So with that, what more market forces do you see playing in that, and how, you know, what should we be thinking about with those forces?
Well, I would say several things. So first off, we are living in a world that the expansion of possibilities is massive. So whether that is sensors, I gotta tell you now, nobody, and I've talked to the CEOs of these companies, nobody knows how 5G is gonna affect our world. Whether it's the people spending billions of dollars of capital rolling it out, whether that's the manufacturers, you know, whether you run a hospital or an auto plant, how does 5G affect your process? Nobody knows. And so in that world, how do you make progress in that world? For all of you, how is that going to transform what you do? I have no idea, and nobody does. The people spending billions of dollars don't know that. So when you start thinking about the nature of the world we live in, 5G, IoT, basically ubiquitous computing, create a massive set of possibilities for us to imagine a world that we don't fully understand what that looks like, and then we therefore have to cast about how we drive kind of forward in that world. And again, what I would say, what makes it difficult is, in technology 30 years ago, you could say, okay, I'm going to go to 4 or 5 trusted vendors. I'm going to go to IBM and Microsoft and maybe Oracle, whatever. Red Hat, yeah. And get a sense of, like, here's the future, and I'm going to bet on these vendors, I'm going to trust them. But when vendors are no longer the key drivers of innovation, it does require that you build your own capacity and capability to have a sense of what's going on, so you can think about how to drive forward. It's in many ways, it's a scary world in that the level of ambiguity is so high now, but if you flip that around and think about how exciting a world to live in, where we can really imagine and create things that don't exist, it's an exciting world too.
I think so. I totally agree. And I'm glad you mentioned that no one really knows where we're headed with 5G, because we get that question over and over again. So thank you for reiterating that.
And look, I've talked to these CEOs of people spending billions of dollars. They have no idea. They're like, we're putting it out there and use cases will come. And that's not a bad attitude, right? You know, so I think they'd like to be involved in those use cases, so they're trying hard to figure it out. But really, nobody quite knows how it's going to affect the areas out there. That does bring me to, so how do you think about whether it's that or many of the other things that you need to do? And I do think that, just to try to hammer home how different leading is in a more ambiguous world, I think we all, if you think about what leaders are used to doing in a more known world, you plan. So you say, I'm going to look in the future, I'm going to determine something I want to go do or accomplish. You then prescribe the activities and the metrics and the things to get you there, and then you execute, and execution's all about driving compliance against that plan and, you know, helping coordinate and make those things happen. So you plan, you prescribe, and you execute. And you say, well, okay, that sounds logical. That's what we all do. I mean, that's even still at Red Hat. I spend a lot of my time doing that. But if you back up and you think about, in an ambiguous world, how do you plan for a world that's ambiguous? So it's a quick story on this. I'm well, I'll genericize the names. So I'm on the board of a large academic medical center, maybe based not too far from here. And
might be blue in color.
Yeah, the question is which shade of blue. No. We were having a board meeting where we were walking through a set of long-range plans, and the chancellor's kind of walking through all kind of these things that they're doing. And one of the board members raised his hand and said, look, that all makes sense. This is how I came up with an analogy you heard me use before. He said, but, in my industry, so this is a former CEO of a big 3 automaker in the U.S., said, we spend billions of dollars a year on R&D. We have real confidence in where the world's going. And then Uber comes in with almost no money and is completely upending our market and completely changed how we think about it. How do you plan for that? Right. And that's when I really started noodling on the thought. It's like, well, that's an unfair question because you can't plan for that. And so that's kind of really an unfair question. And then I started recognizing, actually, that's not an unfair question because we all have to configure ourselves for a world that we don't know what it looks like going forward. And so he said, well, but you can't plan for that. And then, so the model that we've tried to use at Red Hat, the middle model I try to use is, rather than planning, you have to do some degree of planning, but how do you really think hard or spend more time thinking about how do I configure my organization to be successful regardless of that outcome? And that's things like, modularity, trying to make sure people understand the mission of the organization so they can, pivot when they need to pivot. So planning turns into more configuring. Right. Prescription, because you can't prescribe, it becomes, kind of much more about how you enable people with the right information, the right tools, build the right culture, that people will figure out what they need to do in that. And then execution becomes much more about how you engage day to day to help people through it. Right. If I can, how are we doing on time? I'd say one quick story. So back to your point, I think you made a point around early on about how you kind of connect people back to the mission. So let me just do a real quick, this is actually a Delta story, but this is when I really kind of got hit over the head of the importance of that. So I said I was 35 when I was asked to be COO at Delta, which was like crazy. I knew nothing about running an organization that big. And right after we filed for bankruptcy, I found myself one night in front of several hundred mechanics. It was a night shift in Atlanta. And, I hadn't planned what I was going to say. It was kind of this kind of thing that just happened. And so I had no idea what to look at. And they're all looking at this room about this size, about this many people, and they're all looking at me, wait for me to say something. And so I just turned on and I walked through the turnaround pitch that we've been giving to creditors. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to move wide bodies to international, and we're going to down-gauge the domestic fleet, and we're going to restructure leases this way. It's a very technical, kind of long 40 minutes. And I get done, and everybody's stunned. And because, I didn't kind of do platitudes. I literally walked through the plan, and they started asking me really intelligent questions. I didn't think anything about it. Went home that night. I woke up in the morning. Now, this was in 2005, so this was before the iPhone. My pager was blowing up with all these texts saying, oh my God, we're hearing that you're talking about the strategy of the company. So the next day I canceled most of my meetings and I went hanger by hanger by hanger for the mechanics talking about this. And then people initially start saying, well, what can I do to be a part of this? How do I help this thing be successful? And the immediate knee-jerk reactions, the first thing you can do is get our planes out on time, right? We're going through a bankruptcy restructuring. Number one, let's get... Whoa. Did I lose somebody's bag? Was that on purpose? I'll just hold it. So I started to get planes out on time. Right. Well, an amazing thing, so this was in August. By January, Delta went from dead last to number one of the major network carriers in on-time performance and has held that position pretty consistently for years. Now, I've been interviewed probably 50 times on what did we do? Right. And the simple answer is nothing. I mean, we actually did horrible things. We cut people's pay, we cut their benefits, we cut resources. But as soon as everybody knew the strategy of the company and they knew the most important thing that they could do was get the planes out on time, it was amazing how people kind of rose to that challenge. And it's not that they didn't know they were supposed to get the planes out on time before, but as soon as people really understood the mission of the company and how their role attached to it, it was like night and day because people are like, okay, now I understand the context. So I'm told to get the plane out, but now that I know why it's so important to the turnaround, they just everybody rose up and just did an extraordinary job to get that done. And I do think so many leaders think their job is to filter information. So I'm going to figure out what I think is important for you to know to do your job. And a leader's role is not to filter information. It is to be the conduit. It is to make sure everybody knows the strategy of the company, what your department or your division and your department is trying to achieve, and be the conduit to connect your job function to that, and then provide people latitude to make sure that gets done. And so I remember one quick example, this was years ago on Delta.com. You know, I talked so much about international. They come back with a plan saying, hey, you know, we were 3 years away from being able to take foreign currencies, but we've heard that, so we've now put that to the top of the list. It was the right thing to do, but you know, it was more a proactive, now that we know the strategy of the company, we've restacked our priorities that way. Do you approve? And it's like I said, of course. And so as soon as you can kind of get that motion going where people know the overall mission so they're lit up about it, they understand kind of the cascading and what's important to make that happen, not only will they work better, but they'll also tweak the work they're doing to make it work. And that's really what you're trying to get when you say digital transformation. When you have your people, it's not saying, I'm going to do what I'm told, but based on the context, I'm going to do what needs to be done. Now you're rolling.
Right. That's awesome. That is awesome. That's, you know, and it's not easy, you know, to your to your point. When you talk about the changes you made at Delta, and you know, when you're doing the things that you were talking about, you know, you're cutting staff, you're cutting pay, but look at the production, you know, from the staff that you had that maintained and, you know, elevated that. And, you know, the big understanding is, you know, that connection between what they do every day and what the company's mission is. And that's very important and good takeaway for all of us. So final question, for the people in the room, if they could take away one thing today, what do you think that should be from conversations?
Recognize that culture is an output of leaders' behaviors. I hear over and over and again, I'm trying an agile transformation and it failed because my culture wasn't ready, or our culture is risk averse, or our culture is this or that or whatever. Well, I always want to look at leaders and say, you define the culture. Now culture is a lagging indicator, so you have to do things that will change over time. But I think leaders have to recognize your behaviors, what you celebrate, your willingness to accept people experimenting and trying and failing, where you spend your time. Probably the single biggest thing, who you promote and their behaviors, because that's what people look at. All of those things kind of work to define your culture. I just use one other recent example. So I was at a board meeting of a top 5 global bank, and the CEO was like pounding on the table saying, we have to have a digital payment strategy. I need a strategy. I want an initiative up and going, blah, 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 blah. I finally pulled him aside and I said, look, you're never going to get a successful strategy out of this because nobody knows how the world of payments is going to change, and everybody knows if they fail, you're going to fire them. So they're going to come up with the most incremental, watered-down strategy that they can say they're successful in, which is not what you need to have happen. You have to go and say, and even words matter. I said, go in there and say, look, we have to experiment to figure out where we need to go in this. I want to run 25 prototypes or proof of concepts. Nobody can spend more than maybe $100,000. This is a big bank, so they have huge. So spend more than $100,000 on any one of these things. And I want to come back in 6 months and I want to review how those are going. No, we'll probably kill all of them. Maybe we'll keep 1 or 2, but we're going to talk about those learnings and what we do there. And that way you're allowing people to fail, you're allowing people to experiment, and you're going to make progress towards this ultimate goal. And so as a leader, so many of us think, again, our job is to filter information. You need to know this, I'll just figure out what you need to know, versus saying, let me give you almost too much. I have a conduit. How do you accept the right kinds of failure? Now, there are failures, you know, in character and other things that are a big issue, but how do you allow experimentation and learning and those types of failures to be part of the organization? How do you encourage voices to speak up in a productive way? How do you coach people who speak up in a destructive way? All those become so important. And so for each one of you, if you really think about your behaviors and how you show up, are really, really, really important. And it's so much easier, especially when people work for you, just to say, you know what, just go do it. Because and I have that problem every single day at time people are complaining about this or that. And I have the organizational authority say just go do it. Right. But every time you do that, it's a little bit like you have an evergreen or a perennial garden and you're stomping across it. Absolutely. You can stomp across it once or twice, but you do it too much, you're going to kill the thing. And so recognizing that at times some of the debates that seem like, well, this is meaningless, the process itself is helping build the culture that's going to get the right decisions to happen somewhere else. So you got to look at it more as an ecosystem, and it's not what I did today, did what I add today every single minute add value? It's hard to say, but if you're creating the right context, and I spend a lot of time, so my job, very simply I think of is, there's a set of inputs that I can work to drive, to try to drive really 4 things. Clarity, does everybody have clarity in what we're trying to do? Commitment, have I connected people back to the mission and the purpose? Or are they committed? Do they feel a sense of ownership? Behaviors, are people exhibiting the right behaviors? And do we have the appropriate cadence? And for us, this cadence about, learning, trying, experimentation. That's the context that I'm trying to run. If I have to get involved, which at times I do, in a day-to-day decision, I look at that as failure. And I think most executives walk in and say, I'm driving the meeting, I'm trying to get decisions done, that's what I do, that's how I add value, that's my role. You got to flip that around and say, if you're having to inject yourself in that, that means somewhere you've failed at creating the context or the system that's going to work. But too many executives look at that as their source of value versus the exception to where the system didn't work. And it's all about culture.
That's awesome. That's great. Jim, thank you. Let's give Jim a round of applause.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm going to stand up a second.
Yeah, I'm going to stand up too, if that's all right. Yeah, I'll hold it, happy to do questions. Also, never wear a jacket.
So take,
I dressed up for you.
Home, please.
I'll take the first one.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Jim, as you look to state government, local government, what are some, from a culture standpoint, where do you see us, where are some key areas we can improve from your observations?
Well, I would say the big positive that government has is most people are here because they believe in the purpose and the mission. And so that's one of the things that's really hard at a lot of companies. If you work for a big bank, right? Okay, well, what's your purpose? And I think you can divide. Well, I think SunTrust has done a really good job of, connecting people to a mission around helping drive financial independence. So you can do that, but at a company, you have to proactively do it. I think in government, that piece is easier. I think the pieces that are most difficult in government is, and I don't know how much of this is just the politics involved or just the nature of it. Making a mistake is bad in government, right? You make a big mistake, all of a sudden you're hauled in front of the General Assembly and you're trying to explain it in front of cameras, right?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Right? But, and it's like, back to that is like the worst possible thing you can do when you're trying to drive innovation, because you have to experiment, you have to try things, you have to make mistakes. Jeff Bezos talks a lot about that. Now, obviously you have the context in which you can work, so there's always going and working and trying to sell the legislature on, hey, you gotta allow experimentation. But I think within the context that you have, that same thing pervades down, where people don't want to take risks, they don't want to make mistakes because they could be career limiting. And how do you make making a mistake at a small enough level that you're not losing hundreds of millions of dollars, how do you make those mistakes actually okay? And that's why using words like experimentation and learning, prototypes. So we're building a prototype. Nobody expects a prototype to go into production. So if you shut that down when we try to prototype because we were learning, right? So figuring out how you can do that, I think is important. The other is information. The gating of information is, I think there's a real sense of need to know versus, an default to open and get really crisp where you don't, I think are two of the bigger things that I've seen in government. I will say this is going to a national level. We had on stage, we had our big customer event a couple weeks ago, and we had Lockheed Martin on stage with us. And we've been doing some interesting things with them. So they're talking about a program where they got special dispensation in the contract to say best efforts, we're going to spend X amount of money, and we're driving feature functionality onto a fighter jet every week using an agile methodology, right? And so we're working with them on that because it's our software infrastructure. But the way contracting works, it's the same thing where you say, here's 5 years, here's the specific things that you have to go accomplish. Anybody who's done agile knows that's the worst possible thing you can do to actually get agile to happen. And so I think that same thinking of as an external contracting, which makes it almost impossible to work with vendors in an agile way, also pervades how organizations work. So recognizing, so those would be the big ones. It's willingness to allow for mistakes and learning and experimentation, default to open versus closed, and really thinking hard about how you can bring in some of this more difficult, kind of longer term contracting and forced set of deliverables that's inconsistent with this newer methodology.
Any more questions? Don't be shy. Got one, Patrick.
So I love the book. Your humility is admirable, I would say. But I've got a line for your question.
Yeah.
Did you ever get your lunch money and your gas money?
Sort of. So after I wrote the book, a guy who works in sales who's been really, really passionate about it sent me the money with the signed note on it, so I have it pinned up there. So my general counsel has never paid me back, but one of our sales guys paid me back, and I literally have the money pinned in my office up there. That was the gas money. I never did get the lunch money. That's a good point. 11 years of compound interest.
Anyone else?
Good to see you.
Admired from afar your sort of brand development and your open process around that. And obviously brand's more than the logo, but I'm curious to see how you just debuted that. And after going through that very open process, what seemed to be an open process around that, curious to see how reaction's been and how you're feeling about that.
Yeah, so we did just do a brand change. Red Hat's old logo was a red hat with, we call it the Shadow Man underneath, so it was a person underneath that was shadowed. Very storied brand. That brand lasted much longer than normal brands. It lasted, I would say, like 18 or maybe 20 years. I mean, it's a long time, almost 20 years. And we did decide to do a brand change, given that we have a number of employees with the logo tattooed. Making a brand change is a big deal. So some of your most passionate people, right? So, in Red Hat style, and there have been a lot of articles written in Brand Week and others about it, we did it in a very open process. So we started off, we created a website. We had people from all over the world contributing ideas and thoughts. We worked to hone that down. We got customers involved. A year ago at our big customer events, we prototyped a set of solutions and we ultimately chose one. There are always naysayers, so there are a few people who love the old brand. I would say the vast majority of people and the feedback has been just wildly positive. And so it's a really interesting way to do it because, when we revealed it, everybody kind of knew what it was because by that point, we had been so open all the way through the process, which made it a really fascinating process. What I found most interesting, though, is people got so engaged in it. We have customers engaged in it. And you talk about building loyalty when people feel like they have a chance to impact your identity. It's a really big thing. So we basically, it's now a red hat. What a shock. But there's a lot of work around the font and how we ultimately did that, and specifically the hat and why. And it really became really engaging. Even the employees with the old logo feel like they like the vintage, and a number have actually gotten the new logo on somewhere else. So.
Any more questions? We got time for them.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting what you were saying about sort of leaning into ambiguous challenges that you don't know the shape of today. And I was wondering how you sort of balance the tension between an organization that has an interest in being reliable and consistent and transparent with the need to be adaptable and accept the possibility of failure.
Yeah, that's the point that every large organization, I think, also needs to work their way through. And I'll use a different example. I'll come back to Red Hat. Every large telco has what is called over-the-top envy. And over-top players on the telco infrastructure are the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. So if you're an AT&T and a Verizon, you're spending $1 gazillion laying down all this capital, and then Google and Facebook and others are running on top of that, making all the vast majority of the profit pools in the industry. So they'll immediately say, I want to be like that. And I keep saying, it's like, no, you don't, because if you were like that, we would never be able to make a phone call again. And what I mean by that is your ability to innovate, there is a trade-off between innovation and your ability to execute at multiple nines of reliability that you expect. And so virtually any company has to operate doing both at the same time. And so that's where I keep coming around to say, Red Hat isn't a better way to run an organization than Delta. Delta's a highly successful airline. It's always on the list of the most admired companies. It is optimized for driving efficiency in a relatively static environment. Red Hat is optimized to drive efficiency in a pretty ambiguous environment. But even within Red Hat, we have to do both. So if you look at how we engage in upstream communities and how we choose the projects that we get involved in, it is very what would appear from the outside to be chaotic, though there is method to the madness. When we snapshot a release and say we're going to support this for 10 years, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux, it's like runs nuclear submarines and most of the military and the entire world's financial system. So it's got to be rock solid. And so the processes that we use as we think about updates and do security patching and all of that look a lot like a traditional organization and a set of metrics around that. And that's okay. And that's why I always want to come back to say there's not a better way. There are different ways to optimize for different things. And most organizations have both. And so how do you think about similar values, broadly a similar culture, but recognize within that you're going to have processes and systems and ways of working that need to be different for different objective functions. It's a little bit like, an engineering solution to one problem might look different than another. Management's an engineering solution to coordinating people's behaviors. And, depending on what you're trying to do, those things can look different, and that's okay. And so I think the key is Red Hat. Most of what I talk about, because I talk about the extreme, is, Red Hat and how we innovate. But, when we snapshot off a release, we got rigorous, standardized processes for how we think about updates and how we do security and, how we do encryption, et cetera, et cetera. And so recognizing you do have to do both. By the way, that's good because different people prefer one versus another, and not everybody wants to get in a room and yell and scream and talk and comfortable with ambiguity. So it's good that there are different things in the world where different people can kind of somewhat self-select. If we had a follow-on.
Yeah, kind of, if you mind. So, like organizationally, do you structure that so that like certain groups or departments will handle more sort of adaptive pursuits and are quicker to pivot and change direction if something isn't working out? Or is that a component that's going to be present in every group, and every group is allowed the sort of freedom in decision-making and scope to sort of plot their way forward?
So it's more of the former, where different groups are somewhat different. Now again, shared culture, people move around back and forth, but in a shared set of values, but different processes is what I would say. So yeah, the groups that are typically driving the engineering cadence of upgrades in, or patching or whatever in what I'll call our factory side, they're typically, it's a different group than the people doing the upstream kind of core development. And so and that's okay. People sometimes will move back and forth. So you want people who, again, share the values, but part of the values you recognize, there's a different way of operating depending on what you're doing. But we generally do separate. I'm not saying that's right. That's what we do. I think you see that more and more. I think the big problem a lot of people have is they'll create an innovation lab, and they'll get the cool space, and the CEO shows up to do the cameo and give the speech and all that stuff. And everybody else thinks like, well, wait a minute, I'm making sure the payroll checks are getting out and they're right. Why are they getting all the attention? And so that's where you got to be really, really careful to say both are important. Right. You can't say, do I want my heart or my lungs? Which of those are more important, right? The answer is yes. And so you do have to do both. And I think you got to be careful saying, yeah, most organizations are trying to build the new, but if you celebrate that too much, you somehow degrade the other set of stuff that has to be done, which for most organizations is still probably the majority of what they have to do in the medium term.
That's good. Another round of applause. We've got time.
Great. Thank you.
Billy, we're going to release the mics to you.
All right.
Hopefully in the same holder.
Jim. Take care.
Thank you.
Let's give one more round of applause to these two leaders.